The relationships between white plantation mistresses and black slaves during the period of American slavery were shaped by extreme power imbalances, coercion, and violence. These interactions are a testament to the profound abuses of power and the dehumanizing conditions that characterize the institution of slavery. During the period of American slavery, particularly in the antebellum South, the lives of white plantation mistresses and black slaves were intertwined in complex and often deeply disturbing ways. The plantation system was built on a rigid hierarchy that placed white men at the top, followed by white women, and at the bottom, enslaved people, both men and women. This hierarchy was enforced through a combination of legal, social, and physical means, creating a system where white women held considerable power over enslaved individuals, despite their own subordinate status to white men. The relationships between white plantation mistresses and black slaves were inherently marked by profound power imbalances. White women on plantations wielded significant authority over the lives of enslaved individuals, controlling their labor, punishment, and even their personal lives. This power dynamic made any form of relationship between a white mistress and a black slave inherently coercive, as the enslaved person had no true agency or ability to consent freely. White mistresses could use their power to coerce enslaved men into sexual relationships. These interactions were often framed as consensual by the mistresses, but the reality was that the enslaved men were in a position where refusal could lead to severe punishment, increased labor, or even death. The mistress's authority over the enslaved individuals' lives meant that any form of resistance was met with harsh retribution, making true consent impossible. Sexual exploitation was a pervasive aspect of slavery, affecting both enslaved women and men. While much of the historical focus has been on the sexual abuse of enslaved women by white men, the exploitation of enslaved men by white women also occurred, albeit less frequently documented due to the societal taboos and the power dynamics involved. White mistresses who engaged in sexual relationships with black slaves often did so out of a combination of loneliness, desire for control, and a perverse exercise of power. These relationships were typically conducted in secret, as they violated the rigid social codes of the time and could lead to scandal and ostracism for the women involved. Despite the secrecy, these interactions were not uncommon and were part of the broader spectrum of sexual violence and exploitation that characterized the institution of slavery. The social consequences of such relationships varied significantly depending on the circumstances. For white mistresses, discovery of a sexual relationship with a black slave could lead to social ostracism, scandal, and in some cases, physical punishment from their husbands or other male relatives. However, these consequences were relatively mild compared to the severe and often lethal repercussions faced by black men. Enslaved men caught in sexual relationships with white women were subject to brutal punishments, including whipping, mutilation, and execution. These severe responses were intended to reinforce the racial and social hierarchy and to deter any perceived threats to the established order. The mere accusation of impropriety was often enough to warrant such punishments, reflecting the extreme vulnerability of enslaved individuals within the system. The psychological impact of these coerced relationships on both the white mistresses and the black slaves was profound. For the enslaved men, these interactions were a constant reminder of their lack of autonomy and the ever-present threat of violence. The trauma of sexual exploitation added to the already immense physical and emotional toll of their enslavement. White mistresses, despite their power, also experienced psychological consequences. Many were aware, at least on some level, of the coercive nature of their actions and the broader injustices of the slavery system. This awareness could lead to feelings of guilt, shame, and internal conflict, although it rarely translated into meaningful resistance against the institution of slavery. Despite the immense power imbalances, acts of resistance did occur. Enslaved men and women found ways to assert their humanity and resist exploitation, even in small ways. This resistance took many forms, from subtle acts of defiance and sabotage to more overt attempts to escape or retaliate against their oppressors. These acts of resistance are a testament to the resilience and strength of the enslaved individuals, even in the face of overwhelming oppression. While specific historical accounts of relationships between white mistresses and black slaves are relatively rare, some documented cases provide insight into the nature of these interactions. These accounts often come from court records, personal diaries, and letters that have survived from the period. One such account involves the case of Lydia, a white mistress, and Jacob, an enslaved man on a plantation in Georgia. Lydia's husband was frequently away, leaving her isolated and lonely. She began seeking out Jacob, initially under the pretext of supervising his work, but their relationship soon took a sexual turn. The encounters were conducted in secret, but whispers of their interactions spread among the other enslaved individuals. When Lydia's husband eventually discovered the relationship, Jacob was brutally beaten and sold to a distant plantation, a fate that effectively severed him from his family and community. Lydia faced social ostracism and was sent to live with relatives in another state, a mild punishment compared to Jacob's brutal treatment. This case highlights the starkly different consequences faced by white women and black men in such relationships, underscoring the profound power imbalances and the brutal enforcement of racial boundaries. In modern times, the legacy of these coerced relationships is an important aspect of understanding the broader history of slavery and its enduring impact. Scholars and historians continue to uncover and interpret these stories, shedding light on the complexities of power, exploitation, and resistance within the slavery system. Contemporary discussions about these relationships often focus on the need to acknowledge and address the historical injustices and their long-term effects on African American communities. The stories of sexual exploitation and abuse are a critical part of a larger narrative of slavery, highlighting the pervasive violence and dehumanization that define the institution.